Simple, fast steps. Step number one, deflation is actually good. We're going to start with a chart going back to 1865 all the way to 2017. This is a chart of the United States dollar, the purchasing power, how strong it is, how many goods and services it buys. Those dollars you have in your savings account. We start at $1. By the time we get to 1900, it's almost doubled in value, meaning the cost of goods and services went down by almost 50%. We insert the Fed, 1913. This year was an epic fail. If any year, not only did we get the Fed, but we got income taxes as well. If we just eliminate that 1 year, think about how much better our lives would be today. Since the Fed came in, the dollar has gone straight down. I'd also like to point out, when we have these steep declines in the dollar, editor, go ahead and throw up this same chart going back to 1800. It's always around the time of a war. So the Federal Reserve or the government has to print up all this funny money to fight these battles. But if we just had hard money, if we could eliminate the Fed and the government's ability to print funny money, we'd not only have a lot less inflation, but we'd also have much fewer war. Definitely a good thing we should all hope for. And I know right about now your friend and family member Fred is saying, yeah, George, I get what you're saying, but that's crazy talk. If we had deflation today, it would be terrible because prices would come down, the cost or the burden of debt would increase, and the whole entire economy would come crashing down. But what they don't understand is it's not deflation that's the boogeyman. It's the way our economy is structured. If we didn't have an economy that was built on asset prices, debt, and confidence, deflation, prices going down, would actually increase demand. Therefore, it would be a good thing. When you're thinking about deflation, you just have to ask yourself, is it the type of deflation that decreases demand or increases demand? Prices going down because the market is more efficient at producing goods and services creates more demand. But a debt deleveraging reduces demand because people have borrowed to consume. Like I always say, the drug addict's problem isn't the heroin, it's the fact he's addicted to the heroin in the first place. But to dive into this deeper, this secret that the Federal Reserve doesn't want you to know, that deflation is actually a good thing, let's take a look at the 1800s. Editor, let's go right to the internet. First, let's go ahead and look at deflation from 1865 to 1900. This is a really cool calculator. I'll try to remember to put the link in the description below. If I don't, guys, just remind me in the comments and I'll do it after we upload the video. I'm using 1865 to 1900 because this is after the Civil War, so I think the number's a little more accurate. But as we can see, prices went down by over 48%. That's really staggering, an average deflation rate of 1.88% per year. In other words, in the year 1900, 52 cents could buy you what a dollar bought in 1865. Now let's look at wages. And whenever I talk about deflation or the benefits, I always have people responding that that would be the worst thing because wages would actually go down and we can't have that. Well, let's look at the facts. I found this report from the BLS and the Fed. It analyzes wages throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s. And it's incomplete. The data back then wasn't as pure, wasn't as good as it is today. But we can take different sections of this and get an idea of what actually happened. So let's look at bricklayers from the year 1890 to 1903. Notice their hours per week, whether it was Atlanta, Birmingham, Boston, or Chicago, went down. In Atlanta, they started working 60 hours a week. By the year 1903, it was down to 57.7. Look at Chicago, started at 48 And by 1903, they're down to 44-hour work week. Very consistent with what we would see today. Let's look at the hourly rate. In Georgia, started at 23 cents per hour. In 1903, 38 cents an hour, an increase of over 50%. And to make sure we're not cherry picking the data, let's look at bakers from a similar time frame, 1890 to 1904. Their hours, again, go down from 64.6 to 61.3. But the wages go up. The hourly rate from 25 cents to 27 cents. And it's even more dramatic in the South Atlantic. Hours going from 67 per week down to 60 per week, while the rates go from 19 cents an hour to 26 cents an hour. I'm not going to read the entire chart, but you get what's happening here. Hours per week are going down and wages are going up. Imagine that. This can actually happen in a free market without the micromanagement of the government. But what was going on with the overall economy? You may say, yeah, George, those two professions could have seen wage increases, but maybe the economy was really struggling because of the deflationary doom the Fed and the Keynesians always talk about. Let's look at GDP in 1865, $9,977,000,000. In the year 1900, $20,766,000,000, an increase of over 100%, while the cost of goods and services are going down by 50%. And let's not forget, that's nominal GDP. If we looked at real GDP, because there was so much deflation, that number would be much, much better. So based on the data we just looked at online, let's go through a few rough numbers so we can really put this into terms that we can apply to our everyday life. So expenses down by 50%. Wages, we'll just say they went up over the 1865 to 1903 time frame by 20%. GDP way up. It doubled in nominal terms. In real terms, who knows? I'd also like to point out nominal interest rates were right around 4%. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart. So what this means in today's language, if you're making $2,000 a month right now and your bills are $2,000 a month, in 35 years, if you just keep doing what you're doing and you don't get any big promotions, you don't have any ambition whatsoever, you're going to go from making $2,000 to $2,400 a month. But your expenses are going to go from $2,000 down to $1,000. So here you don't have any money left over. Here you've got $1,400 a month that you can save and invest. Just back of the napkin math, that averages out to be about $700 a month over 35 years. That means you'll have almost $300,000 in savings. If you're able to get even a 7% real rate of return, and keep in mind interest rates are 4%, and you've got 2% deflation per year. So real rates, just putting it in the bank, you'd make at least 6%. But if you were able to do that over 35 years, you'd have almost $1.2 million. And these aren't exact numbers, but you get the concept. The free market has improved the standard of this person's living dramatically. They don't need Social Security to retire. They don't need the government to come in with a minimum wage or to micromanage everything in the economy. The free market handles the problem. In fact, I'd go so far as to any of the naysayers out there, and I'm sure there's a lot of them, show me the government, show me the program, show me the task force that can produce these types of results in any country throughout history. The only thing that's produced this type of results for everyday people is free market capitalism. And that is definitely something the central planners don't want you to know. Step number 2. The first dark secret the Fed doesn't want you to know is deflation is actually good. The second dark secret is that inflation is actually bad. The Fed and the government have this inflation target. If we could only get to 2% per year, all our problems would be solved. So they try to brainwash everyone into thinking deflation is this boogeyman that we should all be concerned with, but we should really hope and pray for more inflation. Let's look at a chart of inflation going back to 1866 all the way to 2016. I tried to simplify this chart, but I think what I did in the process has made it 10 times more confusing. So bear with me. Like we said in step number 1, the time frame in the late 1800s was deflationary. Then when the Fed stepped in, we had some inflation. World War I got a lot of inflation. We had deflation that was caused by an economic depression in the early 1920s. Then inflation went back up. Of course, we know what happened in the Great Depression. But I'd like to point out that the Great Depression wasn't all deflation. It was just the first part of it. If you look at the latter half of the 1930s, inflation went back up. Then in World War II, we had price controls and they pegged the yield curve. Inflation shot up in the 1940s. But the main thing I wanted to point out with these lines, blue being inflation, red being deflation, that to this point, about 1934, if you look at the chart of inflation, deflation, it's like a heartbeat. It just kind of goes up, down, up, down. It pretty much evens out. But since 1934, the middle of the 1930s, we've had pretty much nothing but constant inflation. What has this done to the economy and the purchasing power of the average Joe and Jane? Well, we know that wages actually go up with inflation, but they lag. And this is very apparent when you start looking at the data. Editor, go ahead and throw up the first chart. We can see that for a lot of Americans, their real wages, adjusted for inflation, and keep in mind those are the inflation figures the government is willing to admit to, have actually gone down since 1980. But this doesn't tell the whole story. Editor, throw up the chart of real wages in the 1970s. In the 1970s, real wages went down faster and had a steeper decline than at any point in time going back to the mid-1930s. So we have to ask the question, what happened in the 1930s? Well, we had Social Security, welfare, and minimum wage. This is important because it gives the government a transfer mechanism to transfer purchasing power to the everyday person out on the street if we go into a recession. The more purchasing power they have, it keeps inflation higher than it otherwise would be. A minimum wage would create an environment where more businesses would go bust in a downturn. So if we have a recession, you have a supply shock while you have sustained demand. That increases inflation. I'm not saying this is why we've had consistent inflation since the mid-1930s, but I am saying these are things that have changed, and it's an interesting thought experiment. They definitely added to the inflation. Whether they were the total cause or not, I don't know. But the whole point is we've had this inflationary environment for almost 100 years. And this forces people and entities to speculate, to take on more risk, go further out the risk curve. Why? Because if the individual's wages isn't staying consistent with inflation, if it's not improving, the only way they can get ahead is to speculate with financial assets. They have to go into the market. They have to have a 401k. They have to get rich by owning their own home, to the point where nowadays all the financial advisors out there tell people that's what they should do. Well, if you're smart, You start a 401k, an IRA. If you're smart, you buy your own home. So when you retire, you can have this wealth accumulated. But remember, going back to the 1800s, we didn't have to speculate in financial markets or financial assets. All we had to do was save money, and by the time we retired, we were all set without the government's interference. Oh, time out. To frame this argument even better, let's go to a recent clip from an interview with Danielle DiMartino Booth and Jeff Gundlach, where they talk about their best advice for getting rich.
The problem is that people don't understand the concept of saving money before you buy something.
That's right.
I've talked about this on my webcast. There's a incredibly funny, but just a golden nugget of a clip from Saturday Night Live from years ago. It's when Steve Martin was on the show.
Oh gosh.
And it's absolutely perfect. It's this couple is in the kitchen. Steve Martin and I can't remember, Jane something, or I think her name was and they're in the kitchen table fretting over their credit card bills. And what are we going to do? We're all this debt. And all of a sudden this guy shows up, like comes on camera, and he goes, "Read my book." And he goes, it's called "Don't Buy Stuff You Can't Afford." and they're like, "What?
I don't understand.
What does that mean?" And he goes, "Well, look at page 1. Save money before you buy something." I go, "Save money?"
Yep.
And he goes, like, "Well, wait a minute. If I don't have the money but I want something, I can buy it, right?" And he goes, "No, you can't buy it." "Really?"
Yep.
And then he says, "But where are you supposed to get all of this saved money?"
Yep.
It's absolutely classic sketch. We were really at a point at one point when I was a kid where we were really scratching to get by. And we were at the supermarket and we didn't have enough money and we had to put stuff back.
Yeah.
And I said to my mother, because there were no credit cards before 1970.
That's right.
So here we are, credit cards had just kind of come around.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Why don't you just put it on the credit card?" And she just looked at me and she says, "Let me tell you something. Never, ever, ever put food on a credit card, ever. Never borrow money to buy food, because that's a slippery slope which ends potentially very badly." I never forgot that. But also when I was a kid, there were no auto loans. So it's one of these things where everyone knows that this is a bad way to go, but it's one of those things where in the short term, there's a payoff, and it's just like our national debt, it's just like so many things that, yeah, you've been saying that this is a problem for years, and look, everything's fine. Yes, it's a problem in the long term, everybody says, but that could be a long, long way away. But what happens is you glue enough short terms together, and all of a sudden the long term is today.
So inflation creates this environment where it's very difficult to save money, and the value of the savings is always going down. If it's difficult to save money, to Jeff and Danielle's point, it's going to be very difficult to get ahead. Simply put, when we have a deflationary environment, savings are good, but debt is bad. When we have an inflationary environment, savings bad, debt good. But think about how badly this distorts the economy. Can you even imagine teaching your kids this, that savings is bad and debt is good? Nobody is going to do that, other than maybe the Keynesians will. Paul Krugman probably does. Can you imagine Paul Jr.? "We found a piggy bank in your room. You're in big trouble, mister, that's for sure. Your mom and I are going to have to think of an appropriate punishment." But this is what people have to do in today's society in order to get ahead. Because if you save money, you're going to be losing purchasing power. But if you take on debt, because the dollar is going down in value, you're actually gaining purchasing power. It's a totally perverse system that we've set up through this inflation, and it all goes back to the Fed and government intervention. What ends up happening is the only people that get ahead are the people who own assets. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This isn't because of free market capitalism. It's because we have a lack of free market capitalism and hard, sound money. And I would challenge all of you that are watching this video right now to crunch the numbers. Look at the data. Don't take my word on it. Do the thinking for yourself and connect the dots. Look at the data from 1970 to 2019 or to today, then go back to the same thing for the late 1800s. During what time period did the standard of living improve the most for the poor and middle class? Step number 3, the third secret they don't want you to know, or they don't even want you thinking about, is who actually owns the Fed. To dive into this deeper, let's go right back to the internet. According to the Institutional Investor website, the #1 shareholder in the New York Federal Reserve Bank is Citibank. Number 2, JP Morgan. Number 3, Goldman Sachs. And while those 3 might not come as a surprise, I think the next 2 will shock you. First, HSBC and Deutsche Bank. And of course, your friend and family member Fred is saying, George, yeah, that's no big deal. I mean, they only get a 6% dividend and they give all of their profits to the treasuries. So we should want the Federal Reserve to make a lot of money because the government gets it and it's a good thing for all of us. It helps us pay down our debt. But what he's not realizing, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, I've done that on a completely separate video. We'll put a link in the description below. But the Federal Reserve even admits that they have a surplus account. So there's money stored there even after they pay the dividend and pay the government. How much? Who knows? But regardless of what's going on with the direct profits, the owners of the Federal Reserve, the bank themselves, are making huge profits without having to get any distribution whatsoever. How is this? Because of the Fed's money printing. They've increased bank reserves, base money. They've come in with a Fed put. And whether it's legit or it's just a psychological game, the bottom line is it's made investors go further and further out the risk curve. It's made the market go up and up and up. While at the same time, it's capped their downside. If they take on too much risk and need a bailout, no problem. The Fed will step in and print as much money as they need, or the government will come in and say they're too big to fail. We have the repo market spike up to 10%, which would wipe out most of the banks. No problem. The Fed will come in, print the money, increase their balance sheet, and quote unquote fix the problem. And then we have a global pandemic that could really affect the investment banks. No problem. Fed and government come in with stimulus, quantitative easing, you name it, that sends the markets to all-time highs, while at the same time giving the investment banks, the shareholders of the Fed, insane amounts of profit. And we can see this play out in this one chart of the Fed's BS. Goes back to 2004 all the way to 2020. Goes from 1 trillion all the way up to 7 trillion. It's going along just completely level, under $1 trillion, $800 billion. We have the GFC, we need the bailout, boom, it skyrockets up over 2 trillion. It's gone up and up and up to 2016. Then they try QT, quantitative tightening. The banks don't like that at all. Repos spikes, what do? They start increasing their balance sheet. We have huge problems with the cerveza sickness. They come in again, start increasing the balance sheet, monetizing the government's debt, and always covering the backs of the banksters that actually own the Fed. And it's not just about the profits, it's about the risk reward. They've got all this upside, but they have very little downside, because at the end of the day, the Fed will come in and print however much money they need to make sure they don't go bust. But let's think this through a little further and connect the dots. The Fed wants us to believe that deflation is bad and inflation is good. and they really don't want us to know who actually owns the Fed. The entities that benefit the most from this smoke and mirrors system that's been set up are the big banks themselves. And that is the biggest secret they don't want you to know. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.